Hello again! Today we'll be discussing the nature of trauma and how CRWBY utilizes it in their storytelling, but first, two things. Firstly, a thank you as always to my wonderful patrons for making this episode possible. Secondly, some context. So there was a Tumblr post that inspired this episode, but it was a lot more generalized and talking specifically about how a lot of fandom responds to this topic, and so I need to explain their post first. So let's go. The post in question talks about how there tends to be two major fandom complaints about villains who have quote-unquote sob stories. The first being that the backstory is being used to justify all the bad things that they did. Honestly, I don't really encounter this one that much. I'm sure it exists, but mostly this seems to be a fandom problem than one with the actual writing. The second contention is that it demonizes people who went through trauma by saying trauma makes you evil. Now this one has a bit more weight to it, especially in series that don't think very hard about their themes, backstory, characters, etc. But, as a general rule, when well handled, or at least meant to be handled well, this idea is less trauma makes you evil and more, to quote the post, people who are never taught or given any healthy, constructive outlets for their emotions will often find unhealthy or destructive outlets. How someone who never learned to cope with their emotions can become a danger to themselves and others, and how people need compassion and help to recover from trauma instead of becoming increasingly angry and harming themselves and others in the process. The article has more observations to make, about how many who adopt a baleful stance on this matter tend to also believe in a rather punitive form of correction where punishment makes people better. How trauma can and does manifest in anger, which when going unaddressed/untreated can grow worse over time. Okay, me again. That's not to say that every villain or bad person has had something bad happen to them, but erasing how people's life experience can shape them, be it in reality or in media, just leads us to bad people do bad things because bad, which is ultimately unhelpful. With that in mind, RWBY has, from a few loud but rather small groups at times, been criticised of demonising trauma victims due to Adam and Ironwood. I would note none of these people ever seem to care about any of the other villains like this. I wonder why. Let's just say I intend to cover why I strenuously disagree with that take. You see, RWBY's handling of trauma at its very core is very much about how we need compassion and support and safety to work through our trauma, and that's deserved by everyone. Almost all the characters in this show have had to deal with no small amount of trauma, and how those around them helped them or hindered them in responding to it in healthy ways informs so much of their development. Some examples. RWBY seems to be veering into a self-destructive handling of trauma by refusing to process it or seek support. When Weiss first arrived at Beacon, she was definitely developing some bad traits as a result of her father's treatment. However, RWBY choosing, after advice, to take the helpful part of Weiss's words and Weiss herself being given some guidance and then seeing RWBY doing as such, opens the metaphorical floodgates for steady healing and self-improvement. Something we see major strides in at various points, but one of the strongest thematically is when Jacques is starting to manipulate Weiss and RWBY come to her support and affirm their found family. Blake's trauma-based responses led her on a more self-destructive than villainous path as well, causing her to self-sabotage, self-isolate and self-flagellate to punish herself, but the support of her family and a nominally safe place to recover gave her what she needed to begin healing, just as she had started at Beacon and continued upon reuniting with her team. I've made it clear I don't care much for Yang's V4 arc due to Tai, but the fact that Yang had somewhere safe to be and then had the emotional support of her team was undeniably helpful. Plenty of characters who went through something like she did would usually at least have some sort of gritty anti-villain period, but Yang's support networks and safe environments gave her what she needed to move forward in a healthy manner. Jaun's a great example of this actually, with him becoming increasingly self-destructive, aggressive and myopic across volumes 4, 5 and 6, with the last one helping level his development out by gently confronting his unhealthy developing habits. Heck, Ren and Nora just having each other likely played a huge role in their formative responses to trauma that both kept them alive and made it harder for harmful coping mechanisms to develop. We are a social species after all. On the more morally grey front, Ozpin in contrast never dipped into villainy, but definitely made decisions that caused harm. Look at Pyrrha being left on the verge of a breakdown after all of that, which is very much a direct result of him isolating himself from any kind of support. Thus, no one knows to give him support, and as a result he ends up internalizing and then projecting his trauma outwards in harmful ways. Now, onto the full-on villains. Salem was perpetually punished and isolated throughout her early life and then seemingly eternal existence, steadily growing alienated, bitter and callous. Cinder was given a sword, training and told to wait, none of which actually addresses her problems, emotional or circumstantial. Then the moment she stopped being a perfect victim, she was treated as a villain and has acted accordingly since then. Both Emerald and Mercury got picked up by someone who had a vested interest in expanding on their worst impulse, just like Cinder herself was. Tyrion even highlights Mercury's too scared and unsure of what awaits him outside fear and violence to leave it. Ironwood's nominal support network was mostly enablers, all of them twisted by Atlas's system that wouldn't let them be weak or process trauma. Get over the death. Here's a new partner. Get over your injuries. Here's a body brace. Let me rip off my own arm and replace it with a machine, rather than just, waiting for it to heal. It's obviously somewhat self-inflicted, particularly on Ironwood's part due to his continual rejection of Oscar's efforts, but due to their environment, it's not surprising so many went down the path they did. Meanwhile, Adam is ironically a bit more like Ozpin in the sense that he had a support network he could have turned to, but he instead tried to make it a reflection of himself rather than, deal with his trauma and become better. This isn't an exhaustive list, and each of these character relationships with trauma and how it interplays, reflects, and contrasts with other characters is a multi-linked series in of itself. There's some great meta out there about Yang being contrasted with many of the villains, for example, but I feel these drive the point home. Namely, that RWBY has a wide range of reactions to trauma, paths to heroism and villainy that doesn't vacate personal accountability, but acknowledges just how impactful both good and bad in personal life can be and how it shapes the person we become or can grow into. Thanks for tuning in! Oh, and if you'd like to help out with episodes or commission 3D models, please swing by my Patreon or Ko-fi for scripts, early uploads, models, and more. For now though, thanks for stopping by.